Good afternoon from the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, and welcome to this webinar on Norway's first 100 days as non-permanent member of the UN Security Council. My name is Torunn Tryggestad, and I'm the Deputy Director of PRIO and Director of the PRIO Centre on Gender, Peace and Security, and I will be the chair of today's webinar. Before we get started, some practical information. This webinar will be recorded and made available on the PRIO webpage and on social media platforms. We have only 1 hour set aside for this event, so we will obviously not be able to go too much into detail on the various topics and country situations. But our ambition in the months and the years to come is to organize a series of webinars or seminars when we can meet again physically, where we zoom in on specific topics and country situations. At today's event, it will be possible to ask questions, but these must be written in the event chat. And please formulate your questions as short and precise as possible. That will make it easier for us to bring the questions forward to the panelists. And depending on the number of questions posed, we can of course not promise that every question will be brought forward and answered. So then to today's topic. As you all know, Norway joined the UN Security Council on 1st January 2021 as an elected member for a 2-year period from 2021 to 2022. It was 20 years since Norway last was a member of the Security Council. And on 10th of April, Norway had served on the Council for its first 100 days. So we thought that this is an opportune time to take stock of where Norway stands. What has been achieved thus far? Has Norway been able to deliver on its promises and live up to expectations? What expectations, some might ask? For what can possibly an elected member and small state like Norway bring to the table in terms of impact on matters of international peace and security? Has the pandemic perhaps made diplomacy at the UN Security Council particularly difficult? And what are the major challenges ahead? Norway has identified 4 thematic areas which will be given priority during its membership period. And these topics are peace diplomacy, inclusion of women, protection of civilians, including children, and climate change and security. And we will try and structure today's webinar around these thematic priorities. With us here today to discuss some of these questions raised and the status of the priority topics, we have Andreas Løvold, who is the Director of the Section for Coordination of UN Security Council Affairs at the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And we have a group of PRIO researchers, including Christian Berg Hartviken, Director of the PRIO Middle East Centre and Research Professor, Louise Olson, Senior Researcher and Leader of the PRIO Gender Research Group, Maria Gabrielsen-Jombert, a Research Director and Senior Researcher at PRIO, and Halvard Buhaug, a Research Professor at PRIO. But we will start out with Andreas Løvold, who will give us an introduction to Norway's 100 first days from the perspective of the MFA. So Andreas, please, the floor is yours. You must unmute, Andreas, please.
Now, okay, I try again. Thank you, Torunn, and many thanks to PRIO. The good thing by repeating this is that PRIO deserves so many thanks for organizing this first webinar, and we're very happy from the MFA side to hear that PRIO is planning a series of webinars with more focused discussions on different issues. To us, it's very good to start with a focus on the 4 overarching priorities. We from the Norwegian side decided to put at the core or at the center of our work in the Council during those 2 years. There are, of course, a plethora of other issues and priorities and country-specific issues, etc., that we also spend a lot of time on. And today we're a group of people from the MFA covering those 4 main priorities. But of course, you all should ask questions about everything, but maybe we should focus on more specific discussions later, but we're happy to try to answer everything. I would also like to thank PRIO for cooperating closely with NUPI in terms of assisting us in the structured dialogue with the research community during our period in the Council. We're going to have the first meeting there in a couple of weeks' time. So that's also deeply appreciated. As Torren said, I'm the head of the coordination team in the MFA. We're a small team, 8 people, which means, and that's my main message, is that the whole ministry, in a way or another, is involved in the work of the Council. So today it's me and my 4 colleagues who are the main coordinators for the key priorities. And of course, our mission in New York is of the center of gravity for our work. But there's so many people involved, so that's important to know that we have this coordination team. Doesn't mean that myself and my team is monopolizing the work internally. And of course, there are other ministries as well. So it's a whole of government approach to what we do, and of course working very closely with the mission in New York. Just briefly, I promised to try to keep it to 10 minutes, my introductory remarks. I would just briefly explain a little bit about our main priorities, how we work related to them, and not the least, some of the achievements up to now. It's not my or our job to self-evaluate ourselves so early. But we're of course happy to listening to reviews in terms of whether we live up to our own or others' expectations to Norway in the Council. Secondly, I would like briefly to say a few words about the Council dynamics, state of play in the Council, how we view kind of, you know, where we are up to now. And then thirdly, just a little bit on the working methods and the daily life of the Council today in terms of limitations and also, of course, some opportunities we have with all the digital meetings. Briefly on the priorities, I'm not repeating them. PRIO has sent out a link to the 4 main priorities: protection of civilians, including children and armed conflict, women, peace and security, climate and security, and peace diplomacy. Which is kind of a Norwegian approach to conflict prevention and preventive diplomacy. What is important to stress here very briefly is that those 4 main priorities are at the heart of our foreign policy in general. We have deep experience on those files. We have worked on so many issues over the many years related to those 4 main priorities. So obviously, for us, it was kind of obvious that these 4 main priorities will be in any way at the center of our work. The main question is how we take it from there. I cannot go through everything, but just to give a few examples on that one, and I think it's important to divide between those 4 thematic issues as thematic issues on the one hand, and secondly, how we do our best in terms of integrating and linking those 4 thematic issues into other work of the Council, and not the least, what is basically the main job of the Council, and that's to address ongoing situations in country-specific conflicts. So those have to be linked. One main priority for us has been to look at how obviously POC and women, peace and security are thematic issues that are far more developed than climate and security. And peace diplomacy is kind of, as I said, our own kind of innovation. So they're a little bit hard to compare, but in general terms, they are important in themselves, but it's also very important to strengthen language when resolutions or presidential statements or press statements, whatever kind of outcome or document the Council decide on, to have references to some of these issues. Of course, there are thematic issues in themselves with a large and long-living agenda, I would say. Even climate and security has been addressed by the Council over the decade, but still we don't have a resolution, for instance. But I don't have time to go into the details of every of them, and that's why I have my colleagues with me to elaborate a little bit further on the commentaries or the views from the experts at PRIO. Briefly, we took up the chair role of 3 quite demanding positions. We're leading the Children and Armed Conflict Working Group. We're chairing the 2 sanctions committee, the DPRK North Korea 1718 committee, and the other sanction committee, the 1267, which is Al Qaeda and ISIL. All of them, in general terms, quite demanding in terms of workload, and some of them also in terms of political sensitivity. And then next year we will co-chair the, it's not a council body, but it's an informal expert group on climate and security that was established last fall, which we will co-chair with another country next year. It's not yet decided who that will be. We're also pen holder for Syria together with Ireland, and we're also pen holder with Estonia on Afghanistan, the situation in Afghanistan. On Syria, it's the humanitarian situation. It's not the situation in Syria as such, including the political. And the main task there is obviously to renew the mandate, which provides access of border crossing, with 1 border crossing at the moment, into Syria. We can come back to the details there. In terms of results, I would just pick a few of them. I think generally it's important to understand that we're not, from the Norwegian side, we're not looking into the kind of the one only overarching resolution or one symbolic event there, or during our presidency that will take place in January next year. We're very much focused on doing kind of incremental steps forward on all the different levels of the work in the Council, be it the resolution, be it a presidential statement or a press statement, be it kind of an informal meeting, any other business, informal interactive dialogues, whatever. There's all these kind of different avenues on how to look at it. But just a few examples. In March, we succeeded after quite lengthy negotiations on Afghanistan to finally get consensus on a press statement that condemned targeted killings against civilians. We got climate change language for first time integrated into the peacekeeping mission in Cyprus on UNFICYP, which is actually the first time you have climate and security language in a resolution outside the conflict in Africa. We have been very active in pushing for meetings on Myanmar and Tigray. We also took very active part in the negotiations on the COVID-19 vaccination resolution that finally was endorsed unanimously late February. At the subsidiary level, I will just mention, Catherine could tell more, but that we succeeded in getting consensus on our first work as the chair of the Children and Armed Conflict Working Group on the conclusions on South Sudan. I think that's just a few of them. But I would just stress that, the different ways to look at, in terms of the question, what you want to achieve. Language is obviously important. Specific resolutions are, of course, important, but also initiatives are very important. We can come back to that. My second point on the Council dynamics, I would just, in a few headlines, I see the time is running. Answering the question about, how is the atmospherics in the council will always depend on from what kind of position you take, what are your expectations, is the glass half empty, is it half full? What I would say, and that's more or less quite objectively, I would say, is that the dynamics in the council is much more constructive so far this year compared to last year in general terms. The council is not really a paralyzed body so far as we can experience and what we see. The council is able to make decisions. 9 resolutions so far, 7 of them have been unanimously adopted. And just to stress that in those 2 cases where it's not been unanimous, it's only 1 permanent member that is the same country that has abstained in those 2 resolutions. And only twice the council, when they tried to get a product, and that was one press statement on Yemen in January, and it was a presidential statement on food security, they failed, but only those 2 cases. So I think in a nutshell, I would just conclude on the dynamics that the council continues, and that's also been the case over quite a long time. It's by and large a consensus body. It's a consensus making machine, with of course exceptions, with of course some country specific issues, and also some thematic issues that are very, very difficult and very challenging to achieve consensus on. And there are a few cases where the council is not really able to address the issue, like, on the political situation in Syria, for instance. I would stress the role of the new administration of the US. There's no direct link, but obviously their contribution in the council has been very positive so far. Just 2 quick examples. The COVID-19 resolutions of February. We had one last summer, but that took 3 months of the council last year to finally agree on the resolution 1st of July 2020. This year it took 1 week, and the focus was on the not only on ceasefire, but on vaccine distribution in conflict areas. The other is climate and security, where during the British presidency the debate was generally viewed as more constructive than what we have witnessed over the past years. No product, but the debate as such expressed where very clearly where the majority of the council members stand. It doesn't mean that the council is fully agreed on the issue, but sent some positive messages. Obviously, some country-specific situations remain very hard to both achieve consensus and also to maintain consensus. We have been very, so far it's been very positive that we have managed to create consensus on Myanmar. That was not given. And it's not given that we will be able to maintain it as the situation further deteriorates on the ground. But the presidential statement of 10th of March was quite significant, I would say, seen from my perspective. Condemning peaceful protesters is not to take for granted or given that you get consensus of such language in the council. You could always say you need more, surely, but as it stands now, it's definitely better than having a paralyzed council. Tigray is obviously also a very contentious and difficult situation. We could maybe come back to that. I just mentioned it. But the dynamics works in the way that it's not like the P5, the permanent members are cooking up things outside in formal channels. The space for the elected members is so limited. It's not the case. It's not true. It's possible for elected members to play a role. And so far we see everyone actually, we see Vietnam now with the presidency being able to put their kind of signature and their focus on their own presidency and this month. And the cooperation amongst the elected members have also improved over the past years. With regular meetings, it doesn't mean that we in every case would agree, but there's a significant steps forward in terms of the internal cooperation. Finally, on working methods, digital meetings are the main working method. We hope next month that there will be open up for more physical meetings. But over the past months, that's been the working method, and obviously that has certain limitations. The only good thing with those meetings is that it's more easy for our politicians to participate, so you get high-level participations in quite many debates. I think I just leave it there. Sorry, I'm a little bit over time already, so many thanks.
Thank you, Andreas. We'll try and find time to pick up on a number of these issues and involving your colleagues later on. But first now to my PRIO colleagues. Let me turn to Christian Berg-Harpviken, because I would like to engage you in a small discussion about one of these priority topics, namely peace diplomacy. Norway emphasized during its campaign for a non-permanent seat that it would bring a lot of experience from its various peace engagements around the world, and in that way strengthen the UN Security Council when it comes to the resolution and prevention of conflict. So how is it going with Norway from your perspective?
Well, I think first of all I'm going to echo something that Andreas also said in his very insightful introduction, namely that there is a need to be realistic as to what can be achieved. And I think that is particularly true for peacemaking. Situations of armed conflict are generally among the most difficult issues that figure on the Council's agenda. For Norway, it's been a basic premise that it will use its ongoing engagements in various peace processes around the world to leverage its influence at the UN Security Council, and vice versa, to use its position at the Security Council to leverage whatever it does in various peace processes. Now, the pandemic, of course, does put certain constraints on that. It restrains diplomatic travel, diplomatic interaction, and I think that has considerable costs when it comes to the idea of leveraging.
One of the many difficult conflict situations that Norway will have to deal with, or are dealing with, is of course Afghanistan, and Norway is also one of the pen holders of that country situation. To what extent, I mean, Norway has long been involved and has played an important role in relation to that peace process. To what extent do you think that being now a member of the Security Council has helped to advance, you know, the peace process there, and Norway's role in that respect?
Well, Norway has been in the very foreground when it comes to advancing Afghanistan's peace process, and I think deserves massive credit for that. That, however, is not happening in the UN Security Council, at least not yet. As we speak, or this very afternoon, the US is going to inform its allies in the 20 years war about its withdrawal plans and about how it sees the peace process going forward. The Council honestly only becomes the main arena whenever it is that the US and, for that matter, other veto powers, Russia being particularly relevant here, wants the Council to be the main arena. But having said that, Norway has certainly drawn attention to important principal issues in the debates that have taken place in the Council. It has emphasized the importance of human rights, emphasized the securing of women's participation in the political process, and also an open space for civil society and the media. It was, for example, instrumental in bringing the head of the chair of the Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission, Shahrazad Akbar, to brief the Council. And as Andreas mentioned, it contributed importantly to the Council's condemnation of the ongoing assassination campaign that is hitting government staff, journalists and civil society activists in Afghanistan as we speak.
But looking ahead, how is Norway positioned, do you think, to contribute to the peace process in Afghanistan with its council seat? Do you think that Norway can do even more?
Well, you know, if we had been a year back, Norway would have perhaps the main front runner for hosting an Afghan peace process. That is no more the case. Still, Norway has massive credibility as a steadfast and proactive supporter of Afghan peace, and that is a very good basis should opportunities arise. Also, we have seen the UN Secretary General recently having appointed a special envoy for Afghanistan, which is signaling a more active role for the UN now that the US is pulling out. And we will have the question, for example, of future resolutions, including the mandate for UN mediation, which will be very important and also will be challenging. And again, it's not a given here that the consensus can be held on the council when these issues gets onto the table. Norway leads important sanctions committees. The Taliban Sanctions Committee is the one that is the key arena here, which is not led by Norway. It leads to a related one on Al-Qaeda and ISIL. The two were actually together until 2011, but have since then been split. But Norway's long-standing involvement, and not the least its relationship to the parties, may matter to smoothen things when the question of delisting central Taliban members comes up, which it very likely will in the next few weeks and months. So altogether, you know, the scope for independent action on individual issues is fairly limited, and therefore the approach that Norway takes also seems to be the most realistic one. It's not the main arena, the Security Council, unless the main actors want it to be. And even then, the influence of elected members is limited. That being said, as we see in the Afghan case, Norway does systematically manage to uphold principles, to formulate language, insert language on issues such as peaceful conflict resolution, women's participation, a secure space for public debate, and make sure that these issues do not slip off the agenda, but that they are always seriously considered, also through that, in a way, holding the other members of the council to account. And that to me seems to be the very theory of change that guides Norway's work on the council. So far, fairly well, fairly successfully done, I would say.
Thank you for now, Christian. You mentioned the inclusion of women in the Afghan peace process, and I would like to move on to Louise Olson, who is one of PRIO's leading experts on the women, peace and security agenda. And you have been doing a lot of research over the last couple of years on Sweden's role as a non-permanent member of the Security Council. And Andreas mentioned that it is important for Norway, the approach to the Security Council membership is to look for or work for incremental steps, moving agendas forward, and not maybe focus on, vanity projects. Is this how you also see how Norway is now trying to maneuver as a non-permanent small state on the Security Council on the women, peace and security issue?
Thank you, Torun, and also thank you, Andreas, for a really interesting introductory remark. And I think also raises for me a lot of questions in terms of curiosity. Just like Torun said, we have this project together with the Nordic Africa Institute on how elected members can serve to sort of promote that women, peace and security are turned into action, and exactly the kind of incremental steps that you are describing. So I would just like to perhaps drill down into that a little bit more, because I don't, after 100 days, I think I have more questions perhaps than an assessment. And one of the critical things, and I think that's exactly what you're putting the finger on, Torun, in terms of there's been a long-standing critique internationally that discussions on women, peace and security have often taken place sort of in a different forum and in separate processes. So both Norway and Sweden have really, so well described by Andreas, really worked with a sort of an integrative approach to get it into the core processes. But what this also brings up and highlights or put the light on is in terms of the political contentions, but also the trade-off between different kinds of priorities when you have to negotiate these issues in relation to other priorities. And also, as brought up by Christian, in relation to the peace diplomacy, and Afghanistan is perhaps a very good example where the P5's different positions on women, peace and security and potentially now rising tensions between them also going on in other parts of the world could potentially play a role for the continued negotiations and eventually the renegotiation of the UNAMA mandate, etc. So I was curious if Andreas and his colleagues could get back and perhaps describe a little bit more on how you see maneuvering and handling such contentions and also balancing different trade-offs, particularly perhaps between peace diplomacy and women, peace and security, as peace diplomacy is a fairly new sort of developing aspect. And I think that also then goes to sort of more concrete negotiations when the UNAMA mandate comes up. I read Ambassador Yule's statement on UNAMA and the developments in Afghanistan in March, and I thought that was a really, really good example of how women, peace and security can be sort of placed and made very concrete and relevant within a specific context. We know that it's problematic that WPS is quite often treated as in a very generic terms. So I thought she had very good examples of what this meant and what kind of issues that were at stake in the Afghan context. But if you then go and look at the UNAMA mandate and other mandates, quite a few of them lately seems to have been moving towards using even more generic language again. And also if you look at that resolution and other later resolutions, it's a fairly long statement with WPS is sort of as a separate part of the resolution and in quite broad terms. And we know that that could mean that it's difficult for an operation to know how to translate this into action on the ground. So what is it exactly that the Council is asking an operation to do? And the other could be that if the Council then asks for reporting back, what is a success, as in when has an operation fulfilled the request by the Security Council. And I think for me, I just came out of an expert meeting at the Nordic Centre for Gender and Military Operations, where they're just discussing exactly this. How do you then turn this into more concrete questions? Really, for me, also raised a lot of questions in terms of if you could give examples of how you now plan to negotiate when this comes up again in order to make this even more concrete.
I think we have to move on, Louise. I'll see if I can come back to you with a few other questions a little bit later. I would like to move on to you, Maria. Maria Gabrielsen-Jombert, you are a senior researcher at PRIO, and you are working on issues relating to protection of civilians. And this has obviously been central to Norwegian foreign policy for many years, and it's a quite broad agenda. So how has this agenda been approached by Norway now during these first 100 days? How have Norway tried to define or to kind of zoom in on this very broad agenda?
Yes, thank you, Torunn. That's a pertinent question on this agenda in particular, because the protection of civilians agenda, or as a priority topic, is a very broad area also. It has been something that Norway has held high for many years. And of course, with Norway's ambition to be a clear and an important voice in humanitarian issues, it's of course also a domain we could expect that Norway would emphasize during its period in the Security Council. But it's also quite broad, and while taking a step back and trying to think about how Norway has approached this, we could of course say that protection of civilians is potentially a concern that should be on the table and should be a concern in almost any topic that comes on the table of the Security Council. And because it's also so broad as such, the protection of civilians is also perhaps potentially more difficult to assess whether and when it has been achieved, because it's a little bit everywhere. But at the same time, so it's potentially more difficult than, for instance, to note that we have inserted an emphasis on the inclusion of women or an emphasis on climatic conditions, for instance. But Norway has also decided to focus on some topics in particular within the protection of civilians agenda, in particular the role of children in conflict, as well as gender and sexual violence in conflicts. So these are also areas that we see already that Norway is emphasizing in different situations, as was particularly the case for the situation in South Sudan recently, but also with statements over the past couple of weeks relating to Myanmar. And it's also something we can definitely expect that Norway will emphasize in the coming year and a half.
Louise was talking about the challenges of maneuvering contentions and priorities, and this is maybe particularly something that is challenging when it comes to, you know, trying to advance topics such as protection of civilians, that you often have to face tough real political issues. Have you witnessed, has there been any particular conflict situations, country situations where Norway had to face these hard dilemmas?
Yes, I would suspect that there has been, but I am also curious to hear what have been the experiences of those diplomats involved on these different issues so far. But of course, I think it's a dilemma that has to be balanced in all of these areas. But perhaps the agenda of protection of civilians is perhaps a field where these with the balancing act between Norway's concern to hold certain principles high and to send strong signals to condemn violence against civilians is crucial. While at the same time there are also what is sometimes referred to as concerns to maintain a good climate of dialogue within the Security Council. So are there situations where these concerns are at odds, where certain compromises have to be made? And of course, the position or the seat in the Security Council is, as we know, the most prestigious table to be sitting at. It's in the international spotlight, but it's also a seat where, which you can certainly testify to, that it's also a role in which a lot of the work is also a lot of behind-the-scenes diplomacy. So I'm also thinking about there is a balancing act perhaps between the expectations of what we can achieve and what is actually achieved in a way behind the scenes. A little bit like a political party going into a government. Not everything is visible, but it's that there's potentially a lot that is being achieved in the informal negotiations behind the scenes and in the closed meetings. That's potentially where some differences are made also beyond the more public statements. And I would say that, or I can imagine that these has been considerations that have had to be weighed, for instance, in responding to the situation in Myanmar, most recently, where Norway has sent very strong signals, but where, of course, also the balancing between the different approaches of other permanent members in the Security Council has to be taken into consideration. But also for the situation in Yemen, for instance.
Thank you, Maria. Andreas, in his introduction, was talking about the topics such as protection of civilians and women, peace and security being thematic agendas that have been on the agenda of the Security Council for a while now. I would like to move on to Halvard Buhaug, research professor at PRIO, and to the fourth and final priority topic that Norway has listed, and that's climate change and security, which is one of these more recent topics. This is a topic that Norway has put a lot of emphasis on, together with countries such as the UK and Germany and Sweden. Yet this is an area that is not that easy to navigate, and where we can see that it's easy to produce results. So how is that? I know you have strong opinions about how Norway has approached this thematic area.
Thanks, Torunn, and also thanks to the other speakers. Yeah, as we've already heard by Andreas Løvold and others, this is not the first year that climate security is put on the agenda for the Security Council. In fact, this week it's been 14 years since the UK led the first open debate of the Security Council on climate change and security. But even so, it remains a challenging topic, I believe, for discussions at the Security Council, in part because we have a scientific literature that continues to debate and to discuss the relevance of climatic conditions and climate change for peace and security. There's a field that still is struggling with relatively weak results and few robust connections between climate and conflict. And so to the extent that there is scientific consensus on the issue of climate change and conflict, there seems to be more consensus on a weak effect than a consensus of any particular strength of an association. And so for that reason alone, of course, it's challenging to come up with compelling evidence to substantiate concrete statements in the council that could motivate collective action among the council members. And perhaps even more importantly, you also have several permanent members of the Security Council with veto powers, of course, who reject the relevance of discussing climate change and security in the Security Council, and they argue that social and societal impacts of climate change are much better dealt with in other UN councils and fora. And also given that we've already heard that the Security Council is a consensus-making machine, again, of course, then it's hard to make progress on climate security in the Security Council.
But what has Norway done so far to raise the awareness on this topic?
Well, Norway has been frequently referring to climate security risks on numerous occasions, certainly most prominently in the February open debate of the Security Council on climate change and security, where Prime Minister Solberg presented Norwegian's take on the issue. In general, I think that Norwegian statements have been relatively cautious, but also quite vague, and often references to climate-related security risks are limited to single sentences in statements that often deal with much broader issues than only with climate change. To some extent, you may also say that, or sense that there is a tendency to reinforce simple and I would argue misleading narratives about climate change being the root cause of violence and conflict, and in particular in Africa. We also heard that for the first time now, climate is mentioned in a resolution outside of the African region, and this is one tendency that I think we should try to avoid.
Thank you, Halvard. Time is really flying. I think we need to open up now for the representatives from the MFA to provide brief comments. If there's anything you would like to pick up on from what has been said here. Andreas, you brought with you a few colleagues. It's Hans Olav Ibreck, who is the policy director at the section for energy, climate and food security. It's Katrine Andersen, coordinator for the protection of civilians. Tor Henrik Andersen, who is a senior advisor. I didn't quite get the topic, but and then it's André Mundal, who is the special envoy on women, peace and security. Is there anyone who would like to take the floor and comment briefly on anything that has been said now by my PRIO colleagues? I don't know who would like to start. Tor Andersen?
Yes, I can give a brief comment.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now, or?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, good. Thank you. My name is Tor Andersen. I'm working in the UN policy section, and I'm one of two coordinators on the issue of peace diplomacy. And of course, I'm not working on the Afghan team, so I'm not able to give specific comments on the Afghan peace process as such. But I can just underline what Christian Berg-Harpviken said, that the strategy that he so cleverly have seen that we have worked along has obviously given some results, because I think he gave some good examples of how we have pushed the issue of human rights, of women, of civil society and media, and also trying to invite participants from civil society into meetings, and by that opening up the space within the Security Council and pushing the agenda. And that is a way that we intended to work, and we have tried to follow up on that. But I would also like to add that the issue of peace diplomacy is kind of a two-sided coin. One is to engage, that Norway is engaged in a number of peace processes around the world and mediation efforts. And of course, we would like to draw on the experience that we have built up through the years on this work in the different country files that we are now engaged in the Security Council. It doesn't mean that we need to engage directly in the same processes as we are engaged in a peace process in the Security Council, but there is a lot of learning that could be done, and where we could draw on experiences from one side to the other. So that's one side of peace diplomacy. The other side is the normative work, ensuring that written projects have relevant reference to preventive diplomacy and sustaining peace, and to provide support for the UN peace efforts and the UN's good offices. And I think that's two sides, but at the same time, there's two different strategies, and we try to pursue both strategies. I'll give you one short example. It's not Afghanistan, but it was when the Council adopted the presidential statement on UN Office for West Africa and Sahel on UNOVAS. Norway helped to draw the attention to the worrying situation in the Gulf of Guinea, where piracy and armed robbery pose a threat to international shipping, security, and regional development. That is an area that maybe doesn't get that sort of full attention, but that's also preventive diplomacy. That's helping to raise an issue that's maybe a bit forgotten, but it also has a direct influence into Norwegian interests, into Norwegian shipping industry, into Norwegian seafarers who are in the Gulf of Guinea. So I'm just trying to broaden out the scope a bit and give a concrete example of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tor Henrik Andersen. André Mundal, the Special Envoy on Women, Peace and Security, would also like to comment, and we need to bring him in on phone because we had trouble with his video. Can you hear me, André Mundal?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please, go ahead.
Great. It's a little unfortunate that I'm not visible, as I took on my best suit for this, but at least I have the solace that all attention is on what I'm saying. But thank you so much. This has been it's been very interesting to listen in. Thank you for all the interventions, and to Louise in particular for commenting on women, peace, and security. Louise, you also mentioned that you have more questions than answers, which I would also say that I have, which I think is a healthy approach while working on such a complicated issue as this in the Security Council. I would just like to particularly comment on this, what you mentioned as a trade-off, because I don't think we necessarily see it as a trade-off, because our agenda in the long term remains clear. So we don't, let's say that we don't trade off on ambition, but it's more of a long game versus a daily process where we sometimes have to adapt in order to still get where we want to go in the long run. And related to that, I mean, if I want to be frustrated, I can only look at the gaps between promises made, council resolutions, speeches, national action plans made, and the progress on the ground from day to day. But then again, if I need cheering up, I can look at the developments in Security Council Resolution 1325 in 2000. And this 20-year story is a story of small wins, like you also said, incremental steps, and a story that now we are part of shaping. And I think Afghanistan is a good example because we remain committed to the aim that there will be a better peace with women included. But ultimately, it's the parties that will negotiate if such happens and end the process. And we won't trade off our aim no matter what the result is. And if there is a result, post that, we will be working hard in Afghanistan still on bettering the conditions of women and on gender equality. And you also mentioned this in generic language, which is something that we try to avoid, which doesn't mean that it won't happen. But just before this meeting, I had a meeting with our embassy in Bamako, for example, to work on the MINUSMA mandate in June, so that we can be as specific and targeted as possible. As a former officer, I use the analogy of shooting with a shotgun versus a sniper rifle. It might sometimes look better if we shoot with a shotgun because the WPS language will be all over the place, but it doesn't really make a difference if all these small fragments are just pulled out and left, and left is only one small one that doesn't really mean much. We'd rather try to be targeted and concrete so that we do make a mark. Of course, we will not always succeed, but this is what we will continue doing. And I will also just mention finally that this is very much a team effort. I feel often more like a cheerleader / company commander than a diplomat in this job, because I am there to make sure that we move in the same direction, embassy, section, New York, and that's the best way that we can be targeted, so that when we have an intervention in the council, we can talk about how some specific women, peace and security language in the previous mandate led to having, let's say, 10 more women included in some particular effort. And in that regards, I also, would like to invite you and anyone that has good ideas for the open debate on women, peace and security in October, for the presidency in January, and for our time going ahead. So thank you so much for this event.
Thank you, André Mundal, and thank you for the invitation to contribute with the input for the Security Council open debate. We will take that challenge. Katrine Andersen, she wants to say something or comment on protection of civilians. So Katrine, please.
Thank you very much for this, and just wanted to be very brief. I think that one of the dilemmas that is the most challenging for us is to be very specific and relevant, because as you rightly said, the agenda is very broad, and protection of civilians issues is relevant in almost everything that goes on in the council, because everything that's linked to peace and security is very much linked to the situation for the civilians in country. So as you said, we've given priority to some of the topics where we feel that we have the information, where we have a civil society, where we have a research community, where we have practical operational experience of what can be done to mitigate or to address that issue, and we try to lift those issues in the council products. I'll just give you a couple of examples. Andreas mentioned the COVID resolution, where one issue that was really key for us to lift in there was to say protection of healthcare. The continuous attacks on the health sector in conflicts is really, it's not only a problem at the moment, but it really impacts global health. So in that sense, we really pushed for that protection of civilian issue, which is the protection of healthcare. And we have been consistently in the monthly meetings on Yemen, the recruitment of children, use of children, the sexual violations that girls and boys, women and men are suffering in that context, not least in detention. Continuously we address that, try to lift that issue in the products, in our own statements, and in the questions asked to whoever is briefing us. So I think what we're trying to do is to look systematically at the agenda of the Council and see where do we have something that is relevant, and where do we have a community, a landscape of actors that actually bring something to the table. And I would like to highlight, just as a final point, civil society input to our work. We are in continuous dialogue with the humanitarian organizations and also with academia on what is going on, what is the experience, what is working, what is actually stopping, for example, the humanitarian access, and what is the latest in terms of recruitment and use of children. What is actually working on the ground in terms of looking at the cooperation between different peacekeeping mandates and political mandates. So it's a kind of it's hard to sort of list the successes. I would rather say that this systematic approach will probably at the end of our 2-year tenure show us also where we can work in country in those contexts that we are engaged in, where we have embassies and partnerships where we can continue to further that agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Katrina. I am afraid that we have come to the end. I promised in the beginning that there would be time for questions from the audience, so I'm really sorry that we ended up not having time for that. There were a few questions raised about country situations, countries such as Myanmar, Ukraine, and Rwanda. I think, without promising too much, I think that these will be country situations that we will probably follow up in some of the seminars or webinars that we'll organize later this year. And there was one question about the collaboration between non-permanent members on the Security Council, how that is working, and maybe that's also something we can come back to on working methods. So I think I will just have to stop here. I think this has been a really interesting first webinar with a sort of, what should I say, mini review of how Norway has been doing on its first 100 days. We will continue to follow Norway on the UN Security Council. So, but for now, I would just like to thank all those who have been contributing, both from the MFA and my PRIO colleagues. And stay tuned and watch out for new invitations from PRIO on Norway on the UN Security Council. Thank you all.